Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
The 24-year-old Carmelita came to the regional center. She was born in a remote village where finding work was very difficult. There were many such villages across the country, and young people tried in every way to leave. They sought to depart for the big cities, hoping to stay there. Even if they couldn't build a successful career, they aimed at least to secure a somewhat decent existence for themselves and help their families. However, the cities weren't eager to accept them, as there were enough unemployed citizens. Therefore, the villagers often settled for unskilled labor and rented rooms. Naturally, parents tried to dissuade their only daughter, but she persisted, arguing that it would be better for everyone. In the end, they gave in, deciding that their daughter had grown up and that there would certainly be more opportunities in the city for a young woman, not only in terms of a career, but also in her personal life. Carmelita herself thought that life would improve and that she would be able to get an education and take out a mortgage for an apartment. And overall, she wanted her life to be like everyone else's, or at least not worse. Additionally, she was driven by a burning desire to relieve her parents' burden, who themselves were in need of buying medicine, ordering firewood, and fixing the roof. In general, it was all about expenses. Carmelita's life path was no different from that of those who had gone before. Everything had to start from scratch, without being too picky or shunning any work. Carmelita was accustomed to labor from an early age because she spent most of her life in the village. So, she first found a job at a vegetable warehouse, where she worked for 3 months. Then she quit because the audacious owner constantly tried to cut her salary, finding non-existent reasons for fines. She had to look for another job and, at the same time, new accommodation, as she lived in a warm shack at the vegetable warehouse. It was fortunate that she was given a few days to stay in the shack, otherwise, she would have had to look for work while sitting on the street. It was complicated to look for it because she didn't have higher education or work experience, but she persistently continued to read advertisements, specifically buying newspapers for this purpose. After some poking around, she found a job as a cashier in a supermarket with low pay, a small room in a remote area, and a nearly hour-long commute home from work on minibuses in the company of enraged, sweaty aunties and tipsy workers. The job, of course, was not easy, involving stress and a salary that didn't match up with the cost of living. But she had to choose either to go back to her native village with no clear prospects or to tough it out and stay in the regional center. She chose the latter, and every morning, gritting her teeth, she went to work, and in the evening, tired, she returned home in a crowded minibus. One day was like another. Nothing changed, and nothing promised good prospects. In general, it was like Groundhog Day. Every day, she witnessed some sort of scandal. How many times she wanted to quit and leave, but the thought that at home, apart from ruin, nothing was waiting for her stopped her and made her endure. But apparently, fate decided to give her a chance. On one of those days, she met Bruno, her future husband. A handsome and, as it seemed to her then, reliable man. If only she knew how reliable he would turn out to be. They met banally and uninterestingly. Another customer approached the cashier, dumping their purchases onto the belt. She scanned their items, and he gathered the purchases into a bag. Then, completely unexpectedly for her, he hastily wrote his phone number on the bill and silently handed it to her. He thanked her for the excellent service and left. She puzzledly tucked the receipt into her pocket and then completely forgot about it in the hustle of the workday. She remembered about it after her shift when the receipt suddenly fell out of her uniform pocket. She picked it up, scrutinized the numbers, and from that moment on, thoughts of the handsome stranger didn't leave her all the way home. Going home in the minibus, she thought, why did he give her his phone number? She was an ordinary village girl, uneducated and not well read to the bone. And he, as it seemed to her, was quite intelligent, well educated, and certainly had a good understanding of people. In these thoughts, the hour-long journey home passed unnoticed, and when she arrived home, she brushed aside all doubts and, finally, called him. He surprised her from the first seconds of the conversation by calling her by name. Although, why be surprised if it was printed on her badge? The conversation was not long but very pleasant and relaxed. Carmelita willingly answered his questions, and he also didn't keep his life a secret. From the conversation, it turned out that the guy was local, single, and worked as a system administrator in a small retail chain. And towards the end of the conversation, he invited her on a date, and she, of course, agreed. These meetings became regular. They walked for a long time and went to the movies. He gave her flowers, paid compliments, and walked her home. What Carmelita liked most was that there was no intrusive banality in their relationship. Like inviting her home for a cup of coffee. They just kissed at the entrance and went their separate ways. However, despite this, the main intimate moment happened unexpectedly, bypassing all those cups of coffee. It happened at Carmelita's birthday party, to which she invited all her coworkers and, of course, Bruno. If usually Carmelita was unpretentious and could easily get by on her own, that day she went all out. She didn't want to cook simple village food, she wanted to impress her guests. So, she searched the internet for recipes for original dishes, then cooked and baked them. In short, she put effort and savings into it. Then, already quite tired, she got herself ready and put on makeup. In general, she was ready to receive guests. But instead of the expected knock on the door, she heard her phone ring. It was her coworker. Another cashier, with whom Carmelita had already become friends. "Hello, Carmelita," the coworker's voice was slightly annoyed and guilty at the same time. "Don't be mad, but I won't come. I'll still give you a gift." "What happened?" "Got a problem with the husband again, he got drunk. I'm off to pick him up from the police station. I'm not in the mood anymore, sorry. We'll catch up. Happy birthday, girlfriend." As soon as Carmelita hung up the phone, it vibrated again. It was the merchandiser who was invited along with his wife. "Carmelita, good evening. Circumstances have unfolded this way, but I'm afraid we won't be able to congratulate you in person tonight." "Why?" Carmelita asked, tired. "I have some personal reasons," he evasively replied, and he began to shower her with elaborate wishes of goodness, happiness, and a permanently good mood. She absent-mindedly listened, thanked him, and bid farewell. Glancing at the clock, she realized there were 15 minutes left. The phone in her hand vibrated. "Don't tell me you won't come," she said. "Listen, my husband slipped and seems to have broken his leg. We're heading to the ER," another coworker said. She was invited along with her husband. "We were almost at your place when he slipped on the way out of the bus. We're sitting on a bench, he's groaning, and we're waiting for a taxi. Oh, here it is. Sorry, it turned out this way. Bye, keep in touch." And again, the phone rang. It was the last of the invitees. "So, why won't you come?" Carmelita asked straight away, not expecting anything good. "Oh, how did you guess?" "Anyway, it doesn't matter. Carmelita, you know I'm selling my apartment. The realtor just called me. She says the buyers will come soon. It seems like they're determined to buy it. Anyway, goodbye. Congratulations. I wish you all the best." She warmly accepted the congratulations, wished him a successful deal, and disconnected. She was offended, and tears welled up in her eyes, her mood plummeted. If Bruno hadn't come either, then everything would have been lost. Her gloomy thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell trill. It was him, Bruno. Her only and, to be honest, long-awaited guest. So they celebrated her birthday together, after which it turned out that she was pregnant. For 3 days, she struggled with doubts. She didn't know if to tell him or not, since she didn't quite believe that the guy would be thrilled. She even wanted to have an abortion, but something made her tell him anyway. His reaction surprised and pleased her at the same time. "Well, that's great," he exclaimed. "Let's get married." They got married, and she moved in with him. She quit her job and gave birth to a boy. Bruno, as a system administrator, earned decently, so there were no problems with money. They lived like everyone else. He worked, and she stayed at home, cooked soups, and raised the baby. But still, she began to notice a certain aloofness in her husband's behavior, although overall, life continued in the same way with the only amendment: there was a child in the house. And with that came the corresponding cares and problems. Carmelita immersed herself in everyday life, and Bruno started staying out late, citing work overload. She believed him, but for some reason, she increasingly had thoughts that he had someone else. She didn't catch him with anyone, no lacy pants fell out of his pockets, and there were no hickeys on his neck. He still ate her cooking, fulfilled his marital duty, and gave gifts. But all this, to say the least, lacked sincerity. It seemed like he did it all just because he had to. Carmelita became pregnant again, this time with a girl. He accepted this news without much enthusiasm, but he forbade her to have an abortion. "You should give birth." So she did. Again, she cooked soups and raised 2 little ones while he worked. But now he started staying out, not for 2 or 3 hours, but until nightfall. He answered all questions monosyllabically: yes, no, I don't know. Then Carmelita noticed how he smiled while texting someone every evening. When she asked, "Who are you talking to?" he replied that it was a new guy from work. He annoyed him with stupid questions on WhatsApp, so he just smiled. Since then, Bruno has stopped coming home altogether. Or rather, he did appear, but only to quickly take a shower, change, and leave again. He didn't answer questions anymore, he just grunted something indistinct and left. But Carmelita still considered herself happy because she had 2 children. They were her main wealth and source of pride. It was the main topic of phone conversations with her parents and friends, as well as reasons for concern. To all questions about her husband and 2 active, curious, and trouble-causing children, she answered with feigned enthusiasm: everything was fine, he worked and earned money. But one day Bruno completely disappeared, he just vanished. In the morning, as usual, he got ready for work, muttered something in farewell, patted the children on the head, and left. He didn't come back at night or in the morning. Just vanished. Carmelita kept calling his phone, trying to reach him. However, the respondent kept saying that the subscriber was out of the network coverage area. So Carmelita, leaving the children in the care of a neighboring pensioner, rushed to the local police station, where she spent a good hour trying to persuade the officer on duty to immediately start searching for her husband. But the officer didn't rush, handed her a sheet of paper, and told her to write a report that a person was missing, while also feeling it was necessary to share his experience. "Do you know how many women like you I've seen? Almost every day they come here with wide eyes, demanding their husbands be found, shouting, trying to break through to the management, and threatening to tear my ears off. They even call us werewolves in uniforms. And then it turns out they came for nothing. Their husbands were either on a bender somewhere for a week or with lovers in their beds. Or they were just visiting their parents and wanted to be far away from their wives. He's not like that," Carmelita protested. "They all say that." The policeman shrugged indifferently and mumbled again about passing family values and general moral decline. Moreover, it turned out that the women were to blame for everything. Carmelita was listening with irritation, doodling on the blank sheet of paper. After writing the report, she handed it through the window. "When will you start searching for him? When did he disappear?" the officer lazily asked, glancing at the report. "Yesterday." "Well, in a couple of days they'll start looking, if necessary, of course." "What do you mean, if necessary?" Carmelita exclaimed and slapped her hand against the wall. "He's gone, and I filed a report. What else is needed? I told you, maybe he's out gallivanting." "What do you mean by gallivanting?" she shouted. "He's not like that." "I've heard this before," the officer waved his hand. "You're free to go, ma'am." But Carmelita had no intention of backing down. She made such a fuss that a passing major approached and asked what the matter was. "Yes, Chief, this lady here is looking for her husband, and I'm acting following the procedure," the duty officer straightened up. The major stared at her, still trembling with anger. "Let's go to my office," he said shortly to her, then turned to the duty officer. Did she file a report? She did. The officer handed him the sheet of paper. A minute later, Carmelita was sitting in his office. The policeman wearily sat down behind the desk. Well, speak up. And Carmelita had to tell everything again. The officer listened attentively without interrupting. When she finished, he continued to remain silent. And you have no idea where he could have gone, right? He finally asked. She shook her head. Then he asked several clarifying questions about quarrels, family difficulties, and presumed mistresses. Carmelita couldn't say anything that shed light on her husband's disappearance. They had some difficulties. What family didn't have them? She didn't know about any mistresses. On the last day she saw her husband, there were no quarrels or conflicts between them. The major sighed. I will take care of your case, he said shortly. You're free to go. Carmelita returned home in a state of confusion. Her husband didn't show up after 3 days, a week, or a month. She called the police station several times and each time received the same unchanged answer: they were searching for him. So Carmelita, completely losing faith in the police, decided to search on her own. First, she went to her husband's workplace, where she had been asking his colleagues questions for a long time. It turned out that Bruno didn't have very good relations with his colleagues and didn't intend to share his life plans with them. In general, no one knew anything. Then she went to the other end of the city to see his alcoholic father. She found him at home, but he was in such an incoherent state that she couldn't get anything meaningful out of him. The last hope to find out something about her husband was his older sister. But she wasn't at home, and her phone was switched off. Another month passed. Carmelita was tired of crying. Moreover, seeing her like this, the children themselves got upset, although they didn't understand why Mommy was crying yet. So she gathered her strength and tried to hold herself together. Also, she was worried because of the absence of money. Carmelita didn't work, as she managed the household, so her husband was the only breadwinner. But now her husband was gone and nowhere to be found, there was no money, and the children needed to eat. Carmelita searched every corner of the house for her husband's stash, but found nothing. There were only $2,000 left in the wallet. There was about the same amount on the card, and ahead loomed the prospect of a frightening death. Carmelita called all her acquaintances, of whom there were few in this strange city, and all were former colleagues. But everywhere she heard the same tune: sorry, the salary was delayed. Listen, I'd gladly help, but I've been fined at work. You know how it is, they are fine with everything around here. I have to pay for a mortgage, sorry. I can manage a maximum of $500, but only on the 20th. I wish someone would lend me some money. With our salary, you can't go far. Understand me, don't take offense. Of course, Carmelita didn't take offense and understood everything. After all, no one was obligated to give her their last. And even if it was not their last, they were still not obligated. Everyone has their own problems and worries, families, and debts. After receiving a polite refusal from yet another phone caller, she felt completely desperate. She slowly walked around the modestly furnished apartment, considering what she could sell. But there was nothing to sell. There were no valuables in the house, no gold jewelry except for the wedding ring and a silver cross. She was already contemplating pawning the wedding ring with a firm intention to do so when she suddenly remembered another ring that her husband had brought home. She had seen it by chance in the desk drawer. She asked him, "Where did you get it?" But she received an unconvincing answer. He said he wore the ring at a friend's house and couldn't take it off himself, so he came home with it. The ring was massive and adorned with gemstones, obviously expensive. However, she didn't know its actual value. Carmelita searched the desk drawer but didn't find the ring. Then she searched through all her husband's belongings again and, after 2 hours, found the ring in the inner pocket of his jacket. Within minutes, she was sitting at the computer, researching the value of similar rings. She combed through the websites of all the stores but couldn't find anything remotely similar. After wasting half a day and feeling thoroughly exhausted, she started looking for pawnshops. This time luck was on her side. There were 9 pawnshops in their small town. She wrote down the addresses, took the ring, and hurried to the nearest one. She didn't think about the fact that it was someone else's item. After all, there was no time for propriety when her own children were starving. She didn't succeed at the first pawnshop. The appraiser turned out to be a young guy who had been examining the item for a long time. Then he concluded that he could offer a maximum of $5,000 for the ring. Even to her, who was far from all these matters, it was clear that it was as good as giving it away for free. She silently took back the ring and dashed to another pawnshop. The second pawnshop was closed. So, after tugging at the door handle, she turned around and went to the third place. The appraisers at the third pawnshop had such surprised expressions that Carmelita concluded the item was quite valuable. So she prepared for lengthy negotiations, resolving to haggle until the end for herself. However, the appraiser didn't even consider bargaining and asked a rather strange question, in her opinion. "Where did you get it from?" Carmelita was outraged. Why did he care? She brought the item. His job was to assess it and give the appropriate amount, not to ask questions. Especially since she couldn't say anything meaningful about the origin of the ring. She didn't know her husband's friend, and honestly, she didn't believe the story at the time. Her husband's response was too unconvincing, and he was too irritated that she had accidentally found the ring. "What does it matter to you?" she asked. "How much is it worth?" "It's expensive," the man smiled. "Even more than you can imagine." Carmelita was inspired by such honesty. Nothing prevented the appraiser from undervaluing the ring, yet here he was, being so honest. "How much is it worth?" she asked briskly, giving him the understanding that she had guessed it. "So much so that I'm afraid I don't have enough cash on hand," the appraiser evasively replied. "Would you mind if I call some acquaintances and ask them to bring the agreed amount?" "What's the value?" Carmelita impatiently asked. 20,000 euros. Carmelita's face stretched in surprise. "Wow! And it looks like such an ordinary ring," she hastily nodded. "Of course, I'll wait." "How much time will it take?" "Don't worry, about 20 minutes. These guys also don't like to drag things out." The appraiser went to make the call, disappearing into the other room of the pawnshop. Carmelita began to stroll around the room, contemplating what she would buy with this money. Her imagination painted a fresh renovation in the apartment, a new dress, new toys for the children, a new washing machine, and a mixer. She would also definitely send some money to her parents so that they would be able to repair the house. And at the same time, they would be happy for their daughter's success. By the way, her parents didn't know that her husband had disappeared. She preferred not to burden the elderly with her problems, knowing how hard they worried about her. She was lost in thoughts, and time passed unnoticed. Her rainbow-colored visions were interrupted by the appearance of 3 sturdy guys in leather jackets with impenetrable gangster faces. The appraiser obsequiously nodded, placed the ring in front of them, and silently gestured towards the woman. "Hey, was it you who brought the ring?" one of them rudely asked, flexing his muscles under his jacket. Carmelita nodded fearfully. Her intuition told her that she wouldn't see either the ring or the money anymore. A suspicion flashed in her mind that no one was going to redeem anything from her. They would take her out of town, hit her over the head with something heavy, and that would be the end of it. "Where did you get it from?" another man demanded. "Just tell us straight, no bullshit. Like, found it, or it was a gift. And what's it to you, exactly?" Carmelita gathered the remnants of her courage and crossed her arms over her chest. "Where did you get the ring, I'm asking?" the man asked. "I inherited it," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "So what?" The guests exchanged glances and burst into laughter. They laughed mockingly and loudly for a long time, while behind their backs, the appraiser chuckled obsequiously. "Turns out Roberto has an heiress after all." One of them laughed. "It seems like she's his great-granddaughter," another said. The third one just chuckled and said nothing. Suddenly the laughter stopped, and they roughly grabbed her under the arms and carried her towards the exit. Carmelita squealed, but someone tightly covered her mouth with his hand. They shoved her into a jeep and drove off somewhere. Carmelita struggled as much as she could, but after receiving a painful jab in the ribs, she quieted down, shedding tears. "Where are you taking me?" she cried. "To meet your ancestor, from whom you inherited the ring," they replied. "Guys, I have kids," she pleaded. "You should have thought about that earlier, but you decided to joke with us. My husband brought the ring home and said he got it from a friend. I don't know who the friend is or where he lives." "It's true," Carmelita almost yelled. "Where's your husband?" "He's missing." "Convenient," one of them nodded. "What is the address?" "Whose?" Carmelita asked, stuttering. "Yours. Let's go to your place and check. Maybe your hubby is home." Carmelita quickly gave the address. The jeep sharply turned and dove into an alley, cutting through the path. Carmelita thanked fate that the children were at the neighbor's house. 5 minutes later, she nervously opened the door with shaking hands. The lock clicked, she was rudely pushed aside, and they began to search the compact apartment. They checked the rooms, the bathroom, the balcony, and the kitchen. "Looks like nobody's here," they pressed her against the wall. "Are you sure he's gone? You're not lying, are you?" She nodded, swallowing her tears. They grabbed her by the collar and dragged her out of the apartment. "You're coming with us. I told you everything. You have the ring, what else do you want from me? Don't worry. The boss will ask you a few questions, and that's it. Just don't joke with him, or you won't see your kids again." "The boss?" she asked with apprehension, realizing that she was in trouble. They didn't answer her, but led her out of the building and pushed her into the car. She remained silent the whole way, trying not to faint from fear and recalling all the prayers she knew and didn't know. 10 minutes later, the jeep pulled up to a luxurious 3-story mansion, and 3 minutes after that, she was sitting in a luxurious living room in front of a short man with a cold, unblinking gaze. The man was about 50 years old, with gray temples, and wearing an expensive robe. Numerous rings adorned his slender fingers. "Roberto, here she is," they pushed her towards the chair. Roberto waved his hand authoritatively, and the Hulk silently exited the living room. "Sit." He pointed with a thin finger to the chair. She perched on the edge of the deep leather chair and glanced apprehensively at the homeowner. "Where did you get it?" the man asked, pointing to the ring on the table. "I honestly don't know where my husband got this ring from. Tell me what you know." Carmelita recounted everything as it was, hesitantly, stumbling, and repeating herself. However, Roberto was listening without interruption, furrowing his sparse gray eyebrows and tapping his thin fingers on the chair. "So you don't know where your husband is right now?" he clarified when Carmelita finished speaking. She shook her head. "When did this happen?" he asked. "When did he disappear?" 2 weeks ago." 2 weeks ago, Roberto repeated it thoughtfully. "That's very interesting." Carmelita wasn't only afraid for her life, but also confused. Why did Roberto suddenly take an interest in her husband? What was the connection? Roberto looked at her, intimidated and quiet. Suddenly, his previously stern face took on a kindly expression. "Don't be so scared. Nothing bad will happen to you. What do you want from me?" "From my husband? And what does the ring have to do with it?" she asked, seeing that no one was going to kill her. "Did he steal it from you?" "Probably, it wasn't him," the owner replied pensively. Carmelita's head began to spin, and her brain refused to understand anything. "Then who?" "That's what I want to find out. The thing is, 2 weeks ago, my wife disappeared. Just disappeared. Vanished off the earth. Well, I didn't look for her because she's a lousy woman. But I was really worried about the ring. And today it's been found." Roberto spoke as if to himself rather than to her. However, Carmelita was already beginning to suspect that the ring, this gangster's missing wife, and her husband were somehow connected. But how? What does your wife have to do with it? You better answer another question for me. Did he tell you anything about his plans before? Maybe he was going somewhere? Carmelita thought for a moment, then shrugged. Take your time, think about it. It's in your best interest, Roberto said with pressure but still smiling. Are you threatening me? Carmelita asked. Why are you even asking? Maybe you'll tell me? Roberto sighed. All right, if it helps you think better. I had a young and beautiful wife. And she disappeared. Just like your husband did 2 weeks ago. And what does that mean? She didn't understand. What's the connection? That's exactly what I'm trying to find out. And I hope you'll help me. By the way, why did you take the ring to the pawnshop? Are you aground? I don't have enough money to feed the kids, Carmelita said, lowering her eyes to the floor. Roberto pondered. Well, he said after a short pause. If you help me, I promise that your children won't lack for anything. How much did they evaluate the ring at the pawnshop? 20,000 euros. Roberto chewed his thin lips discontentedly. Undervalued, indeed. Well, never mind. Will you help me? If you remember something important, you'll get that amount in cash. No deceit. What am I supposed to remember? Carmelita exclaimed. I've already told you everything. For example, where your husband was going. What did he say? I could involve my acquaintances in the search for my wife, but I don't want to involve outsiders in my problems. And you, it seems, are not an outsider anymore. He smirked. However, judging by his sad smirk, it was clear that he was not having any fun. And what does your wife have to do with it? Too many questions, Roberto raised his tone. Just give me the necessary information. Carmelita flinched. Roberto's expression became stern again, and there was anger in his eyes. I need to go home and snoop through his things. Maybe there's something in the computer, she said uncertainly. That's something, Roberto's face softened. And take this. He handed her a golden, rectangular business card. Call when you find out anything. And it's in your best interest not to delay. You'll be taken home. He shouted, and those same thugs who brought her here entered the living room. Take her home, he ordered. On the way home, Carmelita pondered where and what to search for. Carmelita had no intention of delaying, even if she wanted to, which she didn't. However, her almost empty wallet and hungry children only fueled her urgency. As soon as she arrived home, she began feverishly rummaging through her husband's belongings. She had no idea what exactly she was looking for. Just something that would shed light on this murky situation. She threw clothes onto the floor and pulled out drawers of the desk and closets with a crash. She was frantically searching the pockets of jackets, pants, and shirts. Suddenly she realized that among this pile of things were some of her husband's summer clothes, no tracksuit, no shoes, no swim trunks, and no t-shirts. It was strange, as it was already chilly outside. And these clothes should have been neatly stacked on shelves, in shoe boxes, and hanging on hangers with special covers. None of that was there, even though she packed and arranged everything. Also, her husband's large sports bag, his passport, and sunglasses were missing. Carmelita quickly turned on the old computer and began to study the websites her husband had recently visited. She checked his browsing history and immediately came across several real estate websites in Cyprus. For a minute, she collected her thoughts, then took the business card and dialed the number. Roberto answered right away. I searched through my husband's things and didn't find any summer clothes. He was looking for information about Cyprus on the computer, she said briefly. Roberto was silent for a moment on the other end. Hello? She asked. I got it, just thinking. So the lovebirds went to Cyprus for vacation. Lovebirds? Haven't you figured it out yet? He chuckled on the phone. They ran away together. Anyway, I got it. It's not your concern anymore. We'll call you when we get to know something. He hung up without saying goodbye. Carmelita breathed a sigh of relief. However, the feeling of despair returned. The weight of unclear prospects and panicked thoughts descended upon her again. Where should she have gotten money? She could, of course, get a job, but what about the children? There would be too much hassle with the kindergarten, or she could ask the neighbors to look after them, but she would have always asked them for a favor, and it wasn't convenient. Maybe she could find some work online? She tapped something on the keyboard again. After 5 minutes, everything became clear. Almost all the advertisements required either experience, education, or full-time employment. And all the ads about easy money online were either scams or required practical skills she never had. Desperate, she reached for the phone to call her husband's sister, who lived in another district. She was well off, but she didn't maintain a relationship with her brother. She didn't even come to their wedding. Carmelita didn't know the reason for such behavior, and she never dared to ask her husband. It wasn't her business. By the way, Carmelita herself has always had a strained relationship with her. Not to the point of a feud, but during rare meetings, they tried not to talk to each other too much to avoid worsening their strained relationship. The sister listened to the request to borrow a few thousand, and instead of simply refusing and agreeing, she began to scold Carmelita and ask unnecessary questions. From her sister-in-law's long monologue, Carmelita understood that he probably never loved her and just left for another woman. She said it calmly, and Carmelita came to the conclusion that she knew something. "Do you know where he is?" Carmelita asked. "What makes you think I'll tell you?" She replied mockingly. "Because he's my husband and the father of my children. Isn't that enough? And besides, they're your nephews," Carmelita argued. She heard a heavy sigh, and then the woman responded. "And how does that concern me? Those are your problems, not mine." "I see. So, you won't lend me any money either, right?" Carmelita confirmed. "Why should I?" "You shouldn't," Carmelita agreed and said goodbye. She pondered. The phone rang unexpectedly, making her jump. It was her husband's sister. "Hello?" "Listen, Carmelita. I think I should tell you," she began. "I saw them together once." "Them?" "Yes, them," the woman answered. "She's such a stunning lady. However, she went overboard with the plastic surgery. Driving a fancy car. And Bruno is like a pale moth next to her." "What else?" Carmelita sighed angrily. "Do you know where he is?" "I don't know. He asked me, through my acquaintances, to help him get a passport." "And then?" "How should I know what's next?" The shrew retorted. "Just think for yourself, mistress, passport. You're not dumb, figure it out." "I understand." The woman chuckled mockingly and hung up. Carmelita took out cigarettes. She smoked very rarely, only in moments of intense stress. Like now, for example. She sat on the windowsill and, inhaling, had been looking out the window for a long time. There was nothing but darkness outside and emptiness inside. And also loneliness and self-pity. She had nowhere to go and no one to call. Everyone had their problems, and there was no way she could call her elderly parents. Suddenly she felt she couldn't stay home, or she would simply go crazy alone with her thoughts. She needed to talk to someone about anything. Even to keep silent, but not alone. She jumped off the windowsill, put on her shoes, and ran out into the damp night. Standing near the entrance, she resolutely headed towards the square, where she saw a bonfire. Approaching, she saw several people nearby. Judging by their appearance, they were homeless. They were sitting silently, drinking something from mugs. "Guys, do you have something to drink?" Carmelita asked. The misfits glanced at each other in surprise, looking at this seemingly respectable woman. One of them moved over on the bench, gesturing for her to sit. Carmelita silently sat down, took the offered mug, and sniffed it. It's the cheap alcohol. But you asked for it yourself. She downed it in one go, took out a pack of cigarettes, pulled one out, and flicked her lighter. Help yourselves. She heard approving murmurs, and several people reached for the cigarettes. What happened? An elderly man asked in a torn, greasy jacket sympathetically. It's a long story. It just felt so bleak and lonely. Carmelita shrugged and shipped the empty mug. Pour me another? Listen, girl, put the mug down. Don't think we're greedy, but you'll ruin your life, the old man said quietly. You don't need this. The last thing you should do is drink if you feel sad. Believe me, I'm a prime example of that. You won't even notice how you'll go downhill. Go home, everything will work out. There was so much pain and sincerity in his voice that Carmelita obediently put down the mug and hesitantly got up. She walked home, and with each step, she felt lighter. She wasn't exactly sure why. Probably because a stranger, someone much worse off than her, showed her so much compassion that she always lacked. And the thought that she left her children at home while she was drinking with strangers made her feel ashamed. Back home, Carmelita looked at her husband's scattered belongings, took a large garbage bag, and began throwing things into it. She threw things away, angrily thinking that she wouldn't leave anything in the house that could remind her of him. Suddenly she thought, why throw them away when she could turn them into money, which she so desperately needed? She laid her husband's shirt on the bed, and with her phone, she took a few photos. Then she transferred the pictures to her computer via cable, posted the photos on online flea markets, and provided a description and a reasonable price. Within 3 hours, almost all of her husband's belongings were on the internet, including his beloved guitar and fishing gear. She didn't know the prices, so she spent some time studying similar listings. Then she set her price, having it from the usual. She prepared for a long wait, but the calls came pouring in immediately. Some were interested in the shirt, others in the jacket. Some buyers were even interested in the shoes and sneakers. Carmelita even mentally thanked her husband for knowing how to wear and take care of his things. Therefore, their condition ranged from good to very good. Some questioned the suspiciously low prices and received honest answers: no money, no need to feed the kids. Then people started coming, inspecting the items. Some even dared to haggle and nitpick at the unusually low prices. Carmelita obediently lowered the price, received the money, and closed the door behind the buyer. In one day, she opened and closed that door 10 times. Calls and negotiations continued into the next day. And by the evening of that day, there was nothing left of her husband's clothing. Even though the items were sold for practically nothing, she ended up with an amount comparable to half of her husband's monthly salary. Carmelita felt better and immediately rushed to the store, where she bought various things, not chocolates and Kinder Surprise eggs, but practical and inexpensive items such as pasta, grains, chicken, and vegetables. She would live frugally because it seemed like she had plenty of money. In reality, even with strict budgeting, it would barely last 10 days. But at least her heart no longer felt squeezed with helplessness and fear of starving to death. Bruno and Sandra felt little remorse, despite both behaving despicably towards their spouses. Bruno wasn't interested in how his wife and children were doing. And Sandra, tired of her influential but old husband for a long time, was now enjoying the company of the attractive young man. Upon arriving in Cyprus, they initially peacefully lounged on the warm sandy beach, swam in the gentle sea, and in the evenings enjoyed each other's company on the hotel bed in the luxury suite. After a week, when they got bored with the vacation, they finally got down to what they came here for, searching for real estate. They had money, and very good money at that. Before leaving, Sandra transferred a huge sum from her account to her lover's account. They had found a lively Cypriot real estate agent back home, and after meeting him in Cyprus, they spent a long time strolling and inspecting houses. Bruno was fine with anything, but Sandra, being picky and spoiled, wanted something incredibly fantastic. Her list of desires somewhat puzzled the realtor. It was possible, but it required completely different funds. After inspecting another house, Sandra wrinkled her plump lips in dissatisfaction. All these houses are the same and far from the sea. What are you offering us? Everything seems so ordinary. Do you have any other options? Time is running out, after all. The realtor shrugged. This is a good and inexpensive house. But if you agreed to add another $50,000, maybe I could find something closer to the sea. Are you saying that the amount we have is not enough? Sandra was outraged. Maybe you should curb your appetites, huh? Maybe we shouldn't have trusted the recommendations and turned to you. It seemed like the audacious woman was seriously about to quarrel with this, as she thought, cunning realtor. We'll think about it, Bruno quickly replied to avoid a scandal. And for now, take us to the hotel. The realtor, thrown off by the client's audacity and impudence, pointed towards his car. Of course, I'll try to find something suitable by tomorrow. In the car, Sandra tried to provoke a scandal, so Bruno had to shout at his mistress to cool her down. Eventually, they argued, and the realtor, holding onto the steering wheel and looking at them in the rearview mirror, vowed to have nothing more to do with such people. They paid little but acted as if they were handing over millions of dollars. 10 minutes later, he dropped them off at the hotel entrance and quickly drove off to heal his psychological wounds. While they were extremely dissatisfied with each other, they approached the reception desk for the key. You are expected, the administrator said, pointing towards the chairs in the spacious lobby. Both turned and froze in surprise and horror. 3 people stood up from the chairs, a short, slender man with gray hair and a Hawaiian shirt, and 2 tall brutes with muscles bulging under their t-shirts. Despite the man in the Hawaiian shirt wearing sunglasses, Sandra unmistakably recognized her husband. Her first reaction was to run away. She even took a step towards the exit, but her husband's warning shout made her abandon the attempt. Stop right where you are. Before Bruno could even say a word, the brutes grabbed him from both sides. The husband approached Sandra and whispered affectionately, "Hello, dear. I've come to visit you." Sandra nodded, blushing rapidly and feeling her legs grow heavy. And her body shivered with chills. A second later, they were both pushed into the elevator, and a minute later, they found themselves in a spacious double room. Both were thrown onto the wide bed. Roberto sat on a chair opposite the bed with the captives, and the brute stood by the door. "It's nice here, just a bit hot," Roberto said, clicking the remote. The air conditioner obediently hummed, cooling the room. "That's better. How's the rest? Sleeping well, no nightmares?" The captives remained silent out of fear. "Speak up," Roberto demanded sadly. "How did you end up like this? How did you find us?" Sandra stammered. "It was quite simple," her husband replied. "But you better tell me, how did it happen that you, a married woman, ran off to the other side of the world with some bum?" Bruno scowled but said nothing, casting a wary glance at the brutes. "I just tired of it all," Sandra exclaimed heatedly. "Tired of what exactly?" Her husband asked calmly. "Everything." "Everything?" He stood up from the chair and pulled the unfaithful wife towards him so forcefully that the threads on her t-shirt creaked. "Everything, you say? Fed up with not working? Fed up with going to salons and shopping? Fed up with living off my dime? That's it?" Sandra broke free and sat in the corner of the bed, pushing Bruno. "Why are you silent? Say something, you're a man after all." But Bruno remained silent, continuing to gaze warily at her husband's henchman. And through that silence, it was evident he was afraid, revealing that he cursed the day he first met her. He met Sandra entirely by chance. He was working late in the office, coding away, when he suddenly heard a dull thud outside the window. Pushing aside his keyboard, he approached the window. In the dim light of the street lamps, he saw a car with a punctured radiator near a lamppost. There was no one on the street at this late hour, so there were few witnesses. In other words, no one was rushing to help. Bruno dashed out of the office, flew down the stairs in 3 steps, and ran into the yard. By the time he reached the car, the woman had already left it, visibly shaken. Running up to her, Bruno realized that she wasn't shaking from the accident, but from alcohol, as was evident by the strong smell and incoherent speech. The woman sat straight on the ground, kicked off her shoes, and hysterically burst into laughter. Then she rummaged under the seat, pulled out a bottle, and brought it to her lips. "Are you all right?" Bruno asked. The woman looked up, her gaze murky, not fully understanding what was happening, nodded, and again brought the bottle to her lips. Bruno helped her stand up, dragged her away from the car, and sat her on the curb. Patting his pants pockets, he remembered with annoyance that he left his phone on the table in the office. "I need to call an ambulance," he said. "Do you have a phone?" The woman grimaced and gestured towards the car. Bruno approached the wreck cautiously, pulled out a fashionable clutch with rhinestones from the front seat, and approached the stranger, offering it to her. "Why don't you do it yourself?" she brazenly asked. "Get the phone out and make a call." Bruno unfastened the clutch and pulled out a cool smartphone, but the woman suddenly grabbed his pants. "You know what? There's no need to call anyone," she said, snatching the purse and phone and throwing them on the ground. "Just sit with me." Bruno sat down next to her, glancing at the car. "Don't be afraid." The woman grimaced. "It won't explode. This isn't a movie. What's your name?" "Bruno." "I'm Sandra." "Nice to meet you." Bruno didn't know if he was pleased or not, but as he looked at her sideways, he realized that the woman was attractive. At least, she was his type. "I'm just fed up with everything," she suddenly said plaintively. "With life?" "Everything. You know everything. I'm sitting at home, like in a cage, and nobody pays attention to me. Tell me, do you like me?" "Very much," Bruno confessed. "Why does nobody pay attention to you? Aren't you married?" After this question, she unexpectedly burst into tears, burying her face in his shoulder. "Married, but it would have been better if I didn't have such a husband. I wanted to divorce, but he doesn't allow it." Bruno listened to her lamentations and looked out the windows of the houses, where lights began to come on and silhouettes of residents appeared, awakened by the noise. Someone was already standing at the window with a phone, apparently calling the police or ambulance. The stranger continued to pour out her soul, and from this stream of incoherent speech, he learned that her husband was wealthy and influential. He didn't love her at all and didn't notice her. She was nothing more to him than an object, the absence of which he would hardly notice. Bruno said nothing, listening silently and giving the drunken person a chance to speak. Then a police car entered the courtyard, followed by firefighters, and after them, with a howl, an ambulance. After that, everything followed the procedure: police questions, first aid, and the car's evacuation to the impound lot. Sandra was taken to the hospital, and Bruno returned to the office, but he couldn't write anything. She occupied all his thoughts. He came home in the early morning. His wife was still asleep, and he couldn't sleep either, wondering if they would meet again or not. 2 days later, the beauty with a bandage on her forehead, sober and in a taxi, came to him herself. After a brief search through the maze of office doors, she found him and invited him to a cafe to thank him. Bruno accepted the offer and went to the cafe. This time, Sandra wasn't as candid. To be honest, Bruno concluded that she didn't remember half of what she had said that night about the accident. And he didn't remind her. He just looked at her beautiful face and compared it with his wife's, not in favor of the latter. Bruno's wife, Carmelita, couldn't boast of any particular beauty. Yes, she was cute and pleasant, but she wasn't as attractive as his new acquaintance. In general, she lost out to his new acquaintance. And then, somehow unnoticed, they started dating, of course, secretly. Sandra's husband was quite influential in the city and, as they say, widely known in narrow circles. At one of these meetings, Sandra suddenly gave him a ring that looked expensive, although neither he nor she knew the actual value of the item. "Keep this," she said. "Where did you get it?" "Whose ring is this?" he asked, examining the object. "My husband's. He lost it, and I found it. I think it might be useful for us." "Why?" he asked. Do you think I'll live with him forever? She smirked. Even if I leave him, he won't leave me anything. I'll leave without a penny. May God grant me to leave alive. And this ring, I think, is worth a lot. It will be enough for us. And we also need to take care of overseas property. What do you mean? You don't understand anything, do you? She exclaimed. As long as I have money in the account, we need to spend it wisely. And what could be better than real estate? Buying something here doesn't make sense. Let's go, for example, to Cyprus and look for something there. Do you want to live with me in Cyprus? Why Cyprus? Not in Turkey, for example? He asked. It's probably cheaper. Sandra laughed. I can tell you've never been anywhere. I've been to Turkey once, and I won't go there again. Real estate in Cyprus significantly facilitates obtaining a temporary residence permit, and then it's easy to get permanent citizenship. Imagine you're a citizen of a country where the sun and the sea are constant. And don't forget that, if anything, we can rent out this property profitably, and there won't be any shortage of tenants. Bruno shrugged. He had no experience buying houses abroad. So he fully trusted the words of his sharp-witted mistress. And most importantly, we can hide from my husband there, Sandra concluded. Bruno agreed. It's a convincing argument. Bruno, who had never traveled beyond the country and had never lived in luxurious houses, really wanted to go to Cyprus. And so he agreed immediately. And at that moment, he didn't care about his wife or children. Why should he have thought about the family if Sandra was by his side? She was so attractive, unpredictable, and at the same time practical and shrewd. With her, he definitely wouldn't go wrong. Preparation for the so-called escape took about 3 months. During this time, Bruno secretly obtained a passport, studied the website about real estate in Cyprus. Fortunately, no one was monitoring him at his work computer, and at the same time continued to meet his mistress at the hotel in the city. And now, he was trembling with fear, looking at the husband of his mistress, wondering, would they cut off his head right here or, nevertheless, at home? Roberto began to leisurely walk around the hotel room, clasping his hands behind his back. It was unclear from his calm appearance whether he was angry or not. Even if he was, he skillfully concealed it. It was thanks to this composure and the ability not to lose his temper that he survived in the turbulent 90s. And he not only survived, but also preserved his influence and managed to create a decent legal business related to car sales. You know, Sandra, I'm not even interested in how you met this guy, he said, pointing at Bruno. I'm more interested in how he ended up with my ring. Can you explain that to me? Sandra closed her eyes. In all the hustle and bustle and love affairs, she completely forgot about the ring. As if it were a cheap trinket, not her guarantee of not dying of starvation in case of anything. Sandra cast a glance at Bruno. How did you find out about the ring? She hissed, looking at her lover with hatred. He shrugged in confusion. Roberto, looking at their faces, burst out laughing sincerely. What's your name again? Bruno, right? He asked. Bruno swallowed hard and nodded. So, Bruno, if you hadn't been such a skunk who abandoned his children, maybe I wouldn't have found you. Well, I would have found you for sure, it was just a matter of time. But I had more important matters to attend to. With these words, he glanced at his unfaithful wife. Yes, it matters more than some worn-out hag who thinks she can do whatever she wants. However, I never even imagined she would dare to have a lover, run away with him, and, most importantly, expect to get away with it. That's the top arrogance, of course. But that's not the point. Your wife found this ring. She took it to the pawnshop because your children had nothing to eat. Do you understand? Bruno didn't answer. It seems you don't. Your children had nothing to eat while you were having fun. Roberto, still somewhat emotional, raised his voice. However, he quickly regained composure and continued in a calm tone. This ring means a lot to me, and it's not about its value, but about how and from whom I got it. Do you want to hear the story? Bruno didn't want to listen, but he also didn't dare to object. So, once again, he silently nodded. From Roberto's brief narrative, it turned out that when the ring came to him from his brother in the 90s, his car exploded. He recognized his brother's body only with this ring, which meant it was a memory of his brother and therefore something sacred. Stealing it, let alone pawning it, was a very bad thing to do. I'll repeat my question. How did this ring end up with your wife? Roberto asked, finishing his story. Sandra gave it to me, Bruno squeezed out, trying not to look into the eyes of his mistress's husband. I didn't steal it from you, I swear. Coward. Sandra hissed contemptuously, kicking him in the side. Just a pathetic coward, wetting his pants from fear. And why should I risk my life over a ring? He retorted and continued, looking at Roberto. Sandra stole it from you and gave it to me. She said if anything happened, we could sell it for a good price. It's worth a lot of money. Roberto shook his head and sank heavily into the chair. Quietly observing his wife and her lover with the gaze of a scientist studying experimental rats, he thought. The two thugs were standing behind him like massive boulders. The only sounds in the room were the faint hum of the air conditioner and Sandra's soft whimpers. The silence was unbearable, and Bruno asked, "What are you going to do with us?" "I'm not sure yet," Roberto answered in a peaceful tone. "I'm thinking. We could, of course, drown you in the Mediterranean Sea. The local police are unlikely to search for you too hard. I promise I'll forget about your wife. Honestly." Bruno pleaded. "Honestly?" Roberto asked mockingly. Bruno nodded vigorously. "Yeah, honestly." Roberto snorted. "Go on. I'll go back home, explain everything to my wife, and never even come close to Sandra again. Never. By the way, about your wife," Roberto raised a finger, interrupting this pitiful stream. "Let's call her right now and ask if she wants you back." He took out his smartphone, briskly tapped on the screen, and made a video call. "Hi," he said cheerfully, holding the smartphone in front of him. He said it very amiably, as if he were talking to an old friend. "Hello," Carmelita replied timidly. She seemed tired, there wasn't any makeup on her face. "Right now I'm with your hubby." Roberto turned the smartphone's camera to the lovers. "Can you see?" "Yes, I can," Carmelita replied sadly. "Listen, I'm not sure what to do with them," Roberto said cheerfully. "Your husband is begging for mercy, wants to repent, and come back to you. What do you think about that? And your wife is there with him, I assume?" Carmelita asked instead of answering. "Right," Roberto agreed. "I'll deal with her myself. I'm more interested in what to do with your husband. Whatever you say, that's what will happen. You and I are kind of in the same boat, we're both faithful and deceived. And what are the options?" Roberto laughed and turned the smartphone screen to himself. "You're great. There aren't that many options, honestly. Let's say option number 1, your unfaithful husband comes back to you with broken arms and knocked out teeth, but alive. Option 2, your husband becomes lunch for Mediterranean sharks. And the third option, let's say, is that he lives in a cardboard box among the homeless in Cyprus." Carmelita didn't respond immediately. Roberto was patiently waiting, looking at her tired face. "I don't need him here, and I'd feel sorry for the sharks. What if they choke? So, let him live in a box." Roberto laughed. "Carmelita!" Bruno shouted. "Come to your senses. What do you mean, in a box?" "In a cardboard one." She yelled angrily. "Whatever you say," Roberto shrugged. "I'll call you back later, once I'm back." He hung up and looked intently at Sandra. "Sandra, why don't you live in a box too? After all, love makes a cottage a castle." He stood up and looked at his burly assistants. "Take all their money, phones, cards, and documents. Drive them somewhere far away and leave them there." The thugs eagerly stepped forward. "Oh, And by the way, don't hurt them, he's already passing out. Roberto pointed at the horrified Bruno and walked to the door. Holding the handle, he turned back. By the way, whose apartment is it? What apartment? What do you mean, what apartment? The one where your wife and kids live? It's mine. I bought it before marriage, Bruno replied cautiously. I'm registered and live there. You live in a box, Roberto corrected him. Anyway, I figured you should fully embrace the homeless status. If, by some miracle, you manage to get out of here, don't even think about going near your family. Forget about the apartment. If she calls me and complains about you, well, you understand. Roberto drilled him with a long, unblinking stare as a farewell and walked out the door. Carmelita looked at the silent phone and unexpectedly burst into tears. Seeing the video call was equivalent to that joke where a wife returns from a business trip and finds her husband in bed with someone else. It was a vile, unfunny joke, somehow happening in her life. After pulling herself together, she got up heavily from her chair and walked to the children's room. The kids were asleep, peacefully snoring into their pillows. Sated and blissfully unaware of their father's treachery. She didn't know how to tell them about it. But perhaps now wasn't the time. Carmelita gently closed the door and went to the bathroom, looked at her reflection, and recoiled. She saw a broken-down woman staring back at her. She mentally compared herself to her husband's lover and noted that she was undoubtedly losing on all fronts. The other woman was prettier and younger, even if only slightly. Meanwhile, Carmelita's face displayed all the hardships of life. She had facial wrinkles, dull eyes, and hair tousled into a ponytail. Carmelita sighed at her reflection and left the bathroom, sitting at the table, taking paper, and starting to budget, trying to stretch it out as much as possible. Honestly, she didn't have much faith in Roberto's promise of compensation. People like him could promise things and do nothing, and who knew how it could backfire? So here, she had to rely solely on herself. Carmelita meticulously listed groceries in one column, utility bills in another, and items that could be cut down on in a third. She spent several hours on calculations and deliberations. A phone call interrupted this unexciting activity. "Hello, I'm calling on behalf of Roberto," a man said. "Hello," Carmelita replied. "The boss called from the airport and said we should transfer 20,000 euros to your account." Carmelita felt her hands tremble, her heart pounding deeply, and her legs suddenly becoming weak. "Yes, I'm listening," she stammered nonsensically. "No, it's me listening to you," the voice replied calmly. "I need your card number." "I don't have a foreign account." "Well, the boss foresaw that too. There are options. We can transfer to your account at the exchange rate, or I can bring you cash at home. What do you choose?" "Cash," she muttered. "Address?" he requested briefly. An hour later, a well-dressed young man in glasses rang her doorbell. He efficiently handed her a dark, opaque bag. "Will you count it?" he asked. "No, why?" Carmelita asked, frightened. "The boss also asked to tell you that if you have any problems, call him immediately. You know the phone." "What problems?" Carmelita became wary. "Any. Especially if they're related to your husband. Goodbye." Carmelita closed the door behind him, opened the bag, and held her breath as she examined the tight bundles of bills. She sat at the table, putting the bag down, trying to pull herself together, her head spinning. Honestly, she couldn't quite believe that there was a whole fortune in front of her on the worn kitchen table. And for her, it was doubly a fortune because she had never seen so much money in her entire life. She took a tight bundle of crisp new bills, took out 2 sheets, and put the bundle back in the bag. She pushed the list towards herself and wrote in large letters, "Justice exists." Carmelita put the children to bed and was already getting ready to go to sleep herself. It was a busy day. She had spent the whole day with the children in the park, riding carousels, going to the movies, and going to the zoo, and now her legs were just giving out. But her soul was calm. she was confident everything would be okay tomorrow. She no longer needed to worry about how she would pay for the apartment, how to feed the little ones, or what to dress them in. The financial cushion gave her strength. She was already falling asleep when the phone rang. It was Roberto. The last time he called her was a month ago from a hotel in Cyprus. "Hello," she said. "Are you awake?" Roberto asked instead of a greeting. "Not anymore. Why?" "Your husband is being deported from the country back to his homeland." Carmelita's blood ran cold. Over the past month, she has grown accustomed to life without her husband, thinking of him less and less. "What did he do there?" "Nothing, except for being there illegally," Roberto replied matter-of-factly. "He got caught stealing some nonsense. They nabbed him, and now he's going back here." "Should I start worrying?" Carmelita asked. "Unlikely," he replied calmly. "The reason I'm calling is to warn you. I did tell him, of course, but who knows? Maybe he doesn't remember much. Anyway, if there are any problems, call me right away." "Okay, thanks." "And what about your wife?" "She's not my wife anymore." "She's luckier. She found a local guy and now lives with him." "Sandra's like that. She won't miss her chance." "I'm starting to feel sorry for that guy already. Anyway, call me if anything." Carmelita looked at the phone. People like Roberto always frightened her. They always seemed dangerous to her, but strangely enough, realizing that she had such a protector now gave her confidence. It's always nice to know that someone will stand up for you. But Bruno never showed up, not at all, and she didn't know where he was. And she constantly found herself thinking that the more time passed, the less she cared about his fate. That's what happens when you're betrayed. You erase the person from your life forever. She deposited the money in the bank. But the interest rates were so pitiful that she decided to get a job. Carmelita's parents moved in with her, and now she could go to work without worrying that the children would be left unattended. She got a job as a tram conductor, and it was quite a difficult job. No one had ever gotten on her nerves like this, not even her husband. It took a thick skin to withstand insults from passengers who couldn't be pleased, but always found a reason to complain. "Conductor, why aren't you announcing the stops? Why have we stopped? How long do we have to wait for your tram? Why are you giving change in small coins? Why are you letting drunks on board? Why is the door stuck?" And so on. But Carmelita was developing character. A smile on her face, a calm tone, a polite response. However, every shift for her was akin to execution. 100 times she had contemplated quitting this job, but looking at her children, she gathered her strength and went to work. In the evenings, she cooked, played with the little ones, and then collapsed into bed. And in the morning, it all started again. Thanks, her parents helped a lot. She didn't even think about dating another man, deciding to devote herself to raising her children. She didn't have time for it, but it turned out that she had to reconsider her life principles. On the day she met Marco, everything was as usual. Her shift was already ending when a man boarded at one stop. He was pleasant, polite, and well-dressed. "Excuse me, when is the central stop?" he asked, handing over money. "In 2 stops, Carmelita replied. She handed him the ticket and moved on. And then the tram suddenly stopped. So abruptly that she, unable to hold on, fell onto a woman sitting by the door. What an uproar ensued. She was accused of being drunk on duty. And on top of that, they said she was fat and clumsy, although that was far from true. Carmelita was slender. Also, passengers accused her of some car suddenly pulling onto the tracks in front of the tram, causing it to break. What's she got to do with this? The same pleasant man shouted in her defense. By the way, he was the only one who stood up for her. The others, who didn't even throw any ridiculous accusations at Carmelita, preferred to simply turn away and remain silent. The crowd turned on him, and the poor man heard a lot of nice things about himself. However, it was evident that the crowd's opinion didn't bother him much, unlike Carmelita. Hurt choked her. She just wanted to cry. She returned to her place and, sitting down, closed her eyes, enjoying moments of silence until the next stop. "You've got a tough job," she heard, then opened her eyes. The man was looking at her with sympathy and regret. Carmelita smiled and shrugged. "It gets worse sometimes." "Thanks for speaking up," she said. "No problem." He smiled back, and suddenly she felt light, as if nothing had happened, and the dozens of angry eyes of the passengers weren't staring at her now. She smiled back at him. At the next stop, there were only 2 people. After giving them their tickets, she returned to her place. "Your stop is next," she told the man. "Thank you," he said, smiling and heading towards the exit. She was watching him leave with genuine regret that he had left so quickly. The man was pleasant and polite, and from his open face and honest eyes, it was evident that he was decent. Since then, she has seen him almost every morning. They talked between stops. She learned his name was Marco, and he commuted to work every morning. He had recently moved to the city. He was divorced, with adult children. He worked and lived in a rented apartment. Without expecting it, Carmelita found herself looking forward to these encounters, and he confessed that he specifically looked out for which conductor was on duty and only boarded her tram. And surprisingly, or perhaps it just seemed to her, there was less malice around. Either people around became kinder, or all the rude and scandalous types now rode in other trams. She couldn't answer that question. And then they started dating. Carmelita introduced him to her parents, who also liked him very much. Marco knew how to court and give compliments, but he did it unobtrusively and without that cloying romance. Each lived in their place, but Marco often visited, spent long hours playing with the children, or did household chores. For example, he repaired a faulty microwave and fixed the door lock. In general, everything was good. Carmelita felt needed and desired. They already considered themselves almost a family, but one day her lawful husband, Bruno, showed up. It was a typical day off. Carmelita was playing with the kids, and Marco was repairing the stove in the kitchen, which had been inconveniently broken. The doorbell rang. Carmelita went to answer it and immediately froze. Seeing her husband on the doorstep, there was a drunken and foolish smile on his face. "Hello, darling," he exclaimed, the smell of alcohol hitting her in the face. He was leaning against the doorframe to avoid falling. "Why did you come?" she asked instead of greeting him, scrutinizing her husband. He didn't look good, sunken eyes, several days' worth of stubble, and trembling hands. Bruno had been drinking heavily and continuously. "Well, this is my apartment," he declared. "And the kids are mine too." "I don't think it's a good idea for you to see the kids in this state," she countered. "As for the apartment, let's share it." "I don't mind. By the way, where are you living now?" "At a buddy's dorm," he grimaced. "With roaches and boozers." "Well, you're no better yourself," she said, and she walked out onto the landing, firmly closing the door behind her. As if it weren't enough for her parents and children to hear. Yes, and her new man didn't need to see her husband either. She didn't need any scandals. "I don't forbid you to see the kids, of course. But you won't come in this state anymore," she said firmly. Bruno smirked. "Since when did you start dictating terms to me?" "Ever since you cheated on me, betrayed the children, and ran off to the resort with your mistress. By the way, how is she? Heard she found someone in Cyprus?" "Your intelligence seems to be working great," he grimaced. "Of course, with such a protector. And Sandra turned out to not be the person I needed." "We all made mistakes in our time with people," Carmelita shrugged. "Is that about me now?" He bitterly smirked. "Disappointed, are you? What do you think?" She squinted. "How should I feel about a husband who betrayed me?" "I came to make peace," Bruno grumbled. "Maybe we can start over?" Carmelita laughed in his face. "Are you serious? I don't understand. What do you hope for?" How can you expect anything in such a situation? He slid down the wall and covered his face with his hands. Who asked you to give him the ring? Who? He whined. I didn't give it to him. I wanted to pawn it, but it turned out that the ring belonged to an influential person. It's your fault. You emptied the bank account, ran away, and left the children. How was I supposed to feed them? Did you think about that? And now you're going to blame me for something? Carmelita's voice echoed through the stairwell. The door opened, and Marco stepped out. Seeing the unfamiliar man sitting against the wall, he asked if everything was okay. Yes, she replied. By the way, this is my husband. The one I told you about. Marco, who had been about to extend his hand in greeting, quickly withdrew it and frowned. Why did he come here? I don't know, she shrugged and looked at Bruno. Why did you come here? Bruno stood up and gave the unfamiliar man an appraising look. He evaluated his broad shoulders and tall stature as he didn't say anything to him. Instead, he gave his wife a venomous glare. Didn't take long for the old lady to find herself a man, he hissed at Carmelita. Quickly found yourself a man. None of your business. What did you say? None of my business? Bruno erupted. Bringing men into my apartment and then saying it's none of my business? He moved towards her with his fists, but Marco quickly shielded her. Listen to me, he said sternly, shaking him by the jacket collar. You're leaving now, and I better not see you again. Got it? This is my apartment. And you're in my territory right now. Do you think you can dictate to me here? Bruno burst out angrily, clenching his fists in impotent rage. Get out, all of you. Clear out of this living space. It legally belongs to me. And what about the children? Should they leave too? Carmelita asked coldly. Yes. He shouted. It's not even certain if they're my children. Maybe you slept with someone else. Carmelita responded with a resounding slap, and Marco looked at Bruno in astonishment. For him, it must have been very shocking to hear that. Carmelita, of course, had told him about Bruno, but she always limited herself to brief phrases like, yes, he cheated, he left. And that was it, without many details. It turned out she had been choosing her words carefully. He couldn't imagine that things were so bad. Her husband turned out to be an immoral person. Marco made his decision immediately. However, he had long been intending to clarify his relationship with Carmelita. And now, it seemed, a convenient opportunity had presented itself. Let's talk seriously, he proposed to Bruno. I'm not going to fight you. Bruno shuddered and took a step back, just in case. No one is going to fight you, Marco replied disdainfully. I'm talking about something else. You divorce Carmelita, and we all move out of this apartment together. And your legal living space remains entirely at your disposal. Carmelita stared at him in amazement, but from the serious expression on his face, she understood that Marco wasn't joking at all. He was currently living in a rented apartment, as the apartment he had bought in a building under construction was supposed to be ready for occupancy in the first quarter of next year. The apartment was small, but it had 2 rooms. As they say, close quarters, but no offense. Will you marry me? He asked directly. Carmelita nodded in complete bewilderment. I'll pay my respects, you're so sweet. Bruno said it sarcastically. Well, I give you my blessing. I agree to the divorce, and you all get out of here. Not so fast, Marco said, cooling his ardor. Since you have children, the divorce will only happen in court, and that could take months. So, Carmelita will live here in the meantime, and during that time, I'll find suitable rental accommodation. Do I have to wait for several more months? Bruno roared. No way. Get out of here right now. Marco closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't easy for him to control himself, but he tried. Starting tomorrow, you begin the divorce process, and while it's ongoing, she will live here. And if you show up, I'll call Roberto, Carmelita warned. After mentioning Roberto, Bruno immediately deflated, seeming smaller in stature. All his bellicose mood evaporated like smoke from a chimney. He grumbled something spitefully and descended the stairs. Nevertheless, Carmelita still decided to call Roberto. He listened attentively and then said, "Why didn't you call me right away? I warned you." "I don't know, it just happened." Roberto paused, then said approvingly, "Your new man is a good guy, and I respect people like him. Why couldn't you find someone decent before? I could ask you the same thing. Couldn't you find a decent woman?" Carmelita asked, and she immediately stopped herself. Roberto wasn't the person she should speak to like that. To her surprise, he just chuckled good-naturedly. "All right, I got it. Anyway, if you want, I can take care of your husband." "How?" she asked. Drastically, Roberto simply replied, "No, don't." Carmelita exclaimed, feeling a chill inside. "Let's just keep things peaceful." "It's up to you." I would have shown him not to ignore my words. "But, as you wish, it's up to you. So, shall I help with the divorce? I have the right connections in court, I can expedite the process. Honestly, I'd like to help you somehow. You're not a stranger to me anymore." "Thank you." "You're welcome. Take care of your new man, he's the real man," Roberto said as a parting remark. Roberto kept his word. He pulled the necessary strings, and within a month, Carmelita was officially divorced, with Bruno as the alimony payer. Additionally, Roberto helped them find a larger rental apartment while they waited for Marco's new apartment to be completed. A year later, they held their wedding in Marco's new and spacious apartment. It was a simple wedding without any extravagance. All their loved ones were there: Carmelita's parents, Marco's adult children, co-workers, and neighbors. Among the ordinary people, there was one extraordinary guest, a widely known figure in certain circles, Roberto. Except for Marco, no one knew the connection between this businessman and the former tram conductor. There were many assumptions, but nobody dared to ask, deciding it was better not to know. After all, ignorance is bliss.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.